In January 2019, the Pew Research Center asked U.S. adults whether they approved or disapproved of President Donald Trump. Here's what they found when they then broke the numbers down by religion and race. 69% of white evangelicals approved of the president, compared with 48% of white mainline Protestants and only 12% of black Protestants. 44% of white Catholics approved, whereas only 26% of non-white Catholics did. Now, these numbers may not be surprising to you. We have become used to white evangelicals supporting Republicans and black Protestants voting for Democrats. We know that the white mainline and Catholic votes are fairly evenly split between the two parties, and that Hispanic votes tend to be more Democrat than Republican, although not as much as black votes tend to be. All this poll may tell you is that things are, well, how they are. In this video, however, I want to think about how it has come to be this way. I mean, it isn't obvious that white evangelicals and black Protestants, two groups with a lot of theological similarities, should vote so differently. Our current political situation has a history, a complex one, in which religion and race play significant roles. As you might expect, I'm interested in this as a historian. I mean, I like history. I watch Watergate documentaries for fun, so obviously I'm pretty interested in history just because. But I'm also interested as a Christian. Who people vote for doesn't, of course, tell the whole story of what they think, but it does give an indication of what people prioritize, what they think is most important or pressing. And it's striking to me that not just in our current moment of political polarization, but for several decades now, at least at the ballot box, Christians of different races have made different decisions about what is most important or pressing. As a white Christian, I know that a lot of people like me make a very different decision about those things than black or Hispanic Christians do. I think it's important to figure out why. In what follows, I'm going to focus mainly on difference between white evangelicals and black Protestants. Those two groups have the greatest political differences, and their stories tell us a lot about changes in the U.S. political and religious landscape over the past 60 years. In order to understand our current political moment, you have to know that our current political alignments are fairly new. Look for a moment at this map. It's a map of the party congressional representatives from 1918. Now look at this map from 2012. Notice anything? Like the change from a nearly all blue South to a nearly all red South? That's part of what historians call a political realignment. During the last half of the 20th century, the South, particularly the white South, changed parties from the Democrats to the Republicans. As part of that process, the parties themselves changed. They both became parties with a national reach, and they became more identified with being either liberal or conservative. In 1940, there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Now, today, you might be liberal for a Republican or conservative for a Democrat, but probably not an actually liberal Republican or an actually conservative Democrat. That's a shift, maybe even a sea change. The other part of this realignment I want to highlight involves race and religion. Before, say, the 1980s, white evangelicals were politically involved, but they were not primarily identified with one party. Since 1980, white evangelicals have become a reliable and incredibly important constituency for the Republican Party. African Americans shifted too. Before 1964, a significant minority of African American voters, Christian and otherwise, voted for Republicans in national elections. After 1964, African American voters, including Christians, became reliably Democratic voters. So, what happened? Well, lots of things. This story is complex, but keep in mind the following themes: an expanding federal government, what people call secular humanism, gender issues, and of course, race. Let's start with a move to a reliably Republican white South. Here, the themes of an expanding federal government and race are key. Our story begins in the 1930s. Starting with the New Deal, the federal government began to expand, affecting the daily lives of people who, up to that point, might only have noticed the federal government when they visited the post office. With the New Deal, however, people received Social Security cards and got jobs in the WPA. That expansion of state power, particularly during the 1930s, led to different reactions. Some white Protestants hated the New Deal. I mean, calling FDR the Antichrist, hated it, because they saw the expansion of state power as an affront to personal liberty and to individual responsibility. But some, and this was true of many white Southern Democrats, accepted the New Deal as an appropriate emergency measure in the face of economic crisis. As we move into the late 1940s, some white Protestants who had supported the New Deal began to think differently about expanding federal power. As historian Darren Doshek has shown, one important case in point was in Southern California, a place many folks from the Bible Belt had moved in order to work in new industries, particularly the defense industry. In California, these Southern Democrats encountered a very different Democratic Party, one interested in what they called social democracy, or the continued intervention by the government in the economy. This vision alienated white Democratic conservatives who thought that once the economic crisis was over, government intervention should be too. That the liberal wing of California's Democratic Party also worked for greater racial equality did not endear it to many white Southern transplants either. Over time, many of these Southerners left the Democratic Party and joined forces with the pro-business, more libertarian wing of the Republican Party in California. Now, what happened in California's Republican Party might not immediately seem like a national story, but it was. The wing of the Republican Party that these white Southerners helped to animate, through its support behind conservative Barry Goldwater in 1964 and behind Ronald Reagan, who became governor of California and eventually president. In line with its more libertarian positions, this wing of the Republican Party claimed that racism was most effectively taken care of through the free market and personal responsibility. As Reagan said at a campaign stop in Mississippi, "I still believe the answer to any problem lies with the people. I believe in states' rights, and I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and at the private level. I believe we have distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended to be given in the Constitution to that federal establishment." According to these folks, individual initiative, not government action, was the key to progress. While the Goldwater presidential campaign in 1964 was spectacularly unsuccessful, Goldwater garnered less than 40% of the national vote, it was an important turning point in the realignment that led to Reagan. Goldwater ran on a pro-states' rights platform and, among other things, believed that Brown versus the Board of Education was unconstitutional. To folks who believed government intervention in economic and social life was a problem, Goldwater had the right message. Those folks included Southern transplants in places like California, as well as white Democrats in the South. Goldwater actually succeeded in winning 5 Southern states and outperforming his national average in 6 more. It was the beginning of a Southern turn to the Republican Party. It was also the beginning of the end of significant African American support for the Republican Party. Prior to 1964, a significant minority, up to 30% of African Americans voted for the Republican presidential candidate. Jackie Robinson campaigned for Richard Nixon in 1960. But only about 5% of African Americans voted for Goldwater, and Republican nominees have been deeply underwater with African American voters ever since. Okay, we're getting closer to explaining the white Southern transition from reliably Democratic to reliably Republican. But there's more to say, particularly with regard to white evangelical identification, Northern and Southern, with the Republican Party. Here again, the expanding federal state played a role. Remember, most of the victories of the civil rights movement came because the federal government did something. The Supreme Court ruled that the Montgomery buses could not be segregated. The National Guard protected black students integrating schools. Congress passed civil rights laws and outlawed housing discrimination. Many people today, including some white evangelicals, would say that these were all necessary interventions. But the point is that they were interventions. And they demonstrated that the federal government would intervene over the objections of localities. That made some white conservatives very nervous. The question historians grapple with is why. Here again, we're in the realm of historical debate, or at least a debate about what to emphasize. One answer is that white Christian conservatives rallied together against government intervention once that intervention became about equal rights for black people. In other words, white evangelicals mobilized to protect segregation as much as they could. Some historians note that a key moment in white conservative political galvanization and identification with the Reagan wing of the Republican Party came in response to the IRS's decision, one supported by the Republican Nixon administration, to remove the tax-exempt status of religious schools that discriminated against black students. In 1976, Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist college that forbade interracial dating, among other things, lost its IRS exemption. That action, as well as the IRS inquiries to other schools about their enrollment of minority students, led some white conservative leaders, folks like Heritage Foundation founder Paul Weyrich and Moral Majority leader Jerry Falwell, to mobilize politically and to back presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. Reagan promised that schools would not have their tax-exempt status rescinded, a promise he went back on in 1982 when his administration did not defend Bob Jones before the Supreme Court. But some historians also argue that the fight about tax exemption does not fully explain what brought normal people in the pews, people who might not have cared that much about what happened to Bob Jones University, what brought those folks into what would be called the religious right, and into a firm alliance with the Republican Party. Here, historians tend to emphasize concerns about what conservatives called secular humanism, gender roles, and abortion. These are all related, but let's start with secular humanism. At the very beginning of the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that teacher-led prayer and Bible reading in public schools was unconstitutional. For some Americans, this was simply the logical outgrowth of the Establishment Clause. Prayer and Bible reading, when led by a public employee like a teacher, were an establishment of religion and should not, therefore, be allowed. But for many white religious conservatives, the Supreme Court ruling, A, constituted a federal government intervention into what they thought should have been a local school board issue, and B, established what they called secular humanism as the de facto state religion. The thinking here is that there is no absolute religious neutrality. You either acknowledge a God, theism, or you put humans at the center of reality, secular humanism. What you put at the center of reality is what you worship. Ergo, the state was deciding that humans, not a supreme being, was ultimate. So for some conservatives, what the 1960s demonstrated was that the intervening federal government would intervene on behalf of a hostile religion, secular humanism. That belief led to two conclusions: that a smaller government, one less capable of such intervention, was a good idea, and two, that to the degree that the federal government was going to be interventionist, it should be run by conservatives who intervened in the right way. What was occurring during the 1960s and 1970s around gender and sexuality added to conservative concerns. Gay rights and the feminist movement came on the heels of the civil rights movement, and indeed they positioned themselves as civil rights movements. Opposition to these movements drew white conservatives, North and South, together in a durable political coalition. Indeed, these issues proved much more effective in doing so than opposition to civil rights had. Why? Well, in a nutshell, the Bible has a lot more to say about gender than it does about race. It's hard to mount a compelling biblical argument for racial segregation. But mounting an argument that God created two sexes with different roles in the world, church and home, well, that certainly isn't the only way to interpret the Bible, but it's an easily supportable way. Men, love your wives. Wives, be submissive to your husbands. I don't permit a woman to preach. Suffice to say that for many white evangelicals particularly, both the gay rights movement and the feminist movement were attempts to subvert God's gendered ordering of the world. North and South, such conservatives began making common cause with each other. And that leads us to abortion, because talking about race wasn't fraught enough. As you probably know, in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that women had the right to abortion. At the time, the religious group most consistently opposed to abortion was the Catholic Church. There's a longer story here, but the simple version is that the Catholic Church tended to marry in opposition to abortion to economic positions that were on the left. Before the 1980s, Catholics were overwhelmingly Democratic voters, something that has shifted as the Democratic Party has increasingly defended Roe. Neither white evangelicals nor the Republican Party, on the other hand, consistently opposed abortion in the early 1970s. That changed largely through the work of a man named Francis Schaeffer, who, with Everett C. Koop, the man who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, made a video series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race? Many white evangelicals through this series came to see abortion as one of the most important, if not the most important issue in the country. Schaeffer described abortion as the logical outgrowth of secular humanism. What happens when you put people and not God in the center? According to Schaeffer, you kill babies. Schaeffer's own economic politics were not necessarily conservative, but conservative political operatives, such as conservative Paul Weyrich, who not incidentally also spearheaded the fight against the IRS's tax exemption rules, believed that they could convince people concerned about abortion that opposition to abortion made the most sense in relation to conservative beliefs about things like small government and personal responsibility. People like Weyrich described abortion as a problem of sexual liberation, of people being irresponsible, of women disregarding their roles as mothers, and of men refusing their roles as fathers. They described Roe v. Wade as the crowning example of a federal government run amok, intervening in what should have been an issue decided at the state level, forcing its secular humanist mentality on citizens. Now, as you doubtless know, over time, the Republican Party made opposition to abortion a major part of its platform. Additionally, its more libertarian or small government wing grew ascendant. More recently, it has championed religious freedom, particularly around Christian opposition to gay rights. At the same time, the Democratic Party, which had once been home to a number of politicians, often but not always Catholic, who were vocally anti-abortion, made protection of Roe one of its major planks and in the past several years championed LGBTQ rights. For white evangelicals who believed that abortion was the crucial issue facing the country, and who saw secular humanism, gender roles, religious liberty, and small government as related to it, that has meant support for the Republican Party. So, does that mean if race wasn't what solely catalyzed the religious right, that it wasn't a factor at all? No, that's not what these historians think. Let's fast forward to 2018 and debates about Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. On June 28, 2018, Thabiti Anyabwile, a black, theologically conservative, pro-life pastor, wrote an editorial in the Washington Post arguing that supporting President Donald Trump in order to get conservative Supreme Court justices, some Christians appear to have made a Faustian bargain for the mere price of a Supreme Court nominee. The devil gets the better end of that deal. For this pastor, evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, had elected a president who had campaigned and then instituted racially unjust policies, ranging from the travel ban to aggressive prosecution of nonviolent drug crimes. Even though he was pro-life, a pro-life justice wasn't worth it. And Anyabwile was not alone in his critique. John C. Richards Jr., a pro-life African-American and managing director at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College, wrote a blog for Christianity Today in which he noted that while a more conservative court may be good for America, it hasn't always been good for blacks in America. And that for many black Christians, conservative strategies have historically made a disparate impact on our communities. For these pro-life, theologically conservative black Christians, the marriage between white evangelicalism, political conservatism, and anti-abortion strategy not only failed to address racial injustice, but increased it. What all of this shows is that race and religion are wrapped up in very different analyses of what is wrong in the country and the remedies for it. What many white conservatives see as the greatest threats to the country, secularism and abortion specifically, are not given the same be-all, end-all importance to many black Christians, even though they might also agree that they are problems. For many black Christians, the positions that come with voting for anti-abortion candidates, again, think here of states' rights, small government, and the like, come with racially compromised pasts. You might argue that theoretically, states' rights in a smaller federal government could serve minority groups well, but historically, that's not what's tended to happen in this country. As poorly as the federal government has treated black people in this country, and these episodes have shown a lot of poor treatment, advances in racial equality, such as abolition, black suffrage, school desegregation, and open housing, often have come through the federal government over the objections of many states. Neither in 1860 nor in 1960 was states' rights the slogan most identified with a commitment to racial equality. So to generalize, where white evangelicals see abortion and secularism as the greatest threats, and will vote for even a twice-divorced former casino order in order to stem them, many black Christians, even pro-life black Christians, see the positions that come with being anti-abortion as significant threats, boons to racism. And that leads to a second point. Today, Christians have a very different understanding of what racism is, how much it still affects the country, and what to do about it. I think this is one of the most vexed issues in our current debates. I'm willing to bet that most people attending church on any given Sunday, or Zooming it, evangelical or otherwise, would say that racism is wrong if you ask them. Indeed, recent polling indicates that conservatives acknowledge racism as a problem in the United States. You would think then that the problem of racism would be a point of agreement across the political and theological spectrum. It isn't. To understand why, you can look at a poll done in 2016. When asked whether, if blacks would only try harder, they would be just as well off as whites, over 50% of white people agreed or strongly agreed, while over 60% of black people disagreed or strongly disagreed. When you looked at political ideology, only 12.6% of very liberal and liberal people strongly agreed, while 74% of conservative and very conservative folks did. Now again, I would bet money that most, if not all, these people would say that racism is wrong and still at least somewhat present in the country. But they differ markedly on the extent to which they think that racism is deeply embedded in social, political, or economic systems. They differ on whether they see racism as largely interpersonal prejudice or as a systematic social ill. They differ on how level the current playing field is. And that means they differ dramatically on what should be done about racism and how much of a priority fighting it should be. If, for example, you think that the legislation of the civil rights movement basically addressed racial injustice in the United States, and that what remains are the beliefs of a few racist individuals, you might think that changing hearts and the workings of the free market can take care of the rest of the problem. That thinking could lead you to believe that if people just try hard enough, they can all equally take advantage of what the country has to offer, and that lack of success shows a failure of personal responsibility. If, however, you think that the civil rights legislation was only a first step in addressing a problem that has fundamentally marred most, if not all, of the political, social, and economic systems in this country, you probably think that well-meaning individuals can participate in and entrench racist systems, and that the free market isn't free, but is one of the fundamentally flawed systems that needs correction from the outside. Add in different perspectives on government intervention and what most threatens the United States today, and you can see how people, most of whom would say that racism is bad, struggle to have any kind of coherent conversation about racism, what racism is, and what should be done about it. And when these people go to vote, they're probably going to check opposing boxes. So where does that leave us? Well, I can tell you that for many, if not most, of American religious historians, it leaves us convinced that racism is a deeply rooted problem in U.S. society. It wasn't solved by the civil rights movement, and it didn't end when the country elected a black president. I'm recording this in June 2020 in Minnesota, in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, and Breonna Taylor's, and Ahmaud Arbery's. It's just not what happened in the 17th century that makes me think that racism is deeply embedded in our country. We have far too much evidence from the last 3 months. I know as a white Christian that judgment puts me at odds with some, but certainly not all, of other white Christians. I can tell you that it's not really the position I want to hold. It's much more convenient for me, white, middle-class, moderate, comfortable person that I am, to believe that the world that has allowed me to be a middle-class, moderate, comfortable person is good and fair, and really not in need of any major changes, or at least not any that would affect me or ask anything of me. But I've been convinced by both history and our present moment that racism has been and continues to be a systematic social problem. Now, all of this may sound like simply bad news, and let's be clear, it is some bad news. But the news only gets worse if we refuse to confront our reality. As Christians, we believe that the truth makes us free. We should pursue it, even when it's difficult to hear, even if it raises questions about our past or the actions of people we love. If indeed the history of race in this country is anything like I have suggested, it might be hard for some of us to acknowledge it. But if my narrative is something approaching the truth, we need to know it and confront it, both for our sakes and for the good and flourishing of others.